globalization, we believe in the principles of cooperation, we believe in the principles of having common rules for everybody. We buy all that. But we now want to be part of the process. We want to join you at the table in working out the new rules, in formulating the new rules and then applying them globally. We want to be there where the decisions are being made. And therefore you got to change a lot of international and other processes and other organizations. Let me end with an obvious example, which is that every year, if you look at the world media, every year the G8 leaders meet, and there's a huge media splash. Everyone talks about this new G8 initiative. Every few years the G8 is trying to remove poverty in Africa. And guess what? Poverty in Africa never gets reduced, while you always have G8 declaration after G8 declaration. That's an example of a process that's gone on autopilot that has no contact with the real world whatsoever. But it goes on. Now that sort of thing has got to be changed. You need obviously to replace the G8 with a new sets of groupings where you bring in all the rising powers, and if you do so, then I think you can create a better world order. So on that note, may I?
Kishore, thank you very much. That's exactly what I hoped for. We've got a few minutes for questions before I want to give Kishore some time to sign books for those of you who'd like to get them. But this was wonderful. I'm going to open with one question, and then we'll work around the room as quickly as we can. You sort of address the management problems, particularly in the government level in the United States. But one of the realities in the world is America. Ken Rogoff wrote an interesting piece a few years ago, which was very prescient. It was called The Debtor's Empire. And his point was that the United States simply couldn't going down the path that it was going and then maintain particularly the structural economic dependencies it was developing. At what point, you're sitting right next to China, you've been negotiating sovereign wealth fund agreements with Bob Kimmitt and others from Singapore, not you yourself, unless you've had something to do with them. But to some degree, what do you think happens if America's management mishaps continue? What do you think the world will do to try and kick America back into shape or to get it onto a different course?
Well, let me begin with the good news first. The good news is that the rest of the world still wants to work with America. And I think that's a very important point to emphasize. I mean, most people believe that despite all his mistakes, despite all his flaws, we can work with America. I mean, many of them try to work with America. What exactly the rest of the world will do if the U.S. continues to be incompetent in its management of various global challenges is that essentially we each will find their own way, and you will begin to find that they will do things among themselves without necessarily involving America. And you see, to some extent, you are seeing this happening already in East Asia. There are various processes going on whereby, because the Asians need to have a certain degree of order and predictability in their own environment, and since America's attention is so intermittent, right? Say, okay, we will carry on. We will do it in the hope that eventually, by the way, that America would join in and become part of the solution. But they're not going to wait for America and say, no, we'll do nothing until America comes along.
Great, thank you. Alan Wolf. It's good to see you, Alan.
There are many questions one could ask because it's a very stimulating discussion. One I would ask is, if you say there are new models to follow for the Middle East in particular, other than the United States or Western Europe, what would you look to as a new model? Would you look to, from the Middle East, would you look to what in China, what in India, or if you say BRIC, Russia, Brazil, why would those be particularly good models? Every country has its pluses and minuses, but what are the aspects that would be particularly compelling for a Middle Eastern country with any of those models?
Yeah, I think the most the most important part of it, the model they're looking for is they want to transform their societies, right? That's essentially what they want to do. They want to have a society with a Some of them have very high per capita incomes if you have oil well. Many of them don't. But you want to have a thriving economy. You want to have jobs for your people. You want to provide education for the vast majority of people. You want to be engaged with the rest of the world. So you look around and you see which are the ones that are most successful at doing it now. And these are the common variables in what you find among the East Asian success stories. And for example, to answer your question a different way, in most Western analysis of what it takes to succeed, the belief is that the most important variable is democracy, for example. I mean, the lesson they have learned is that the critical variable for development is not democracy, because in East Asia you can see situations where democracies succeed, like India, democracies fail. Philippines maybe is an example. And then communist states succeed like China, communist states fail like North Korea. So the common variable is not democracy or not lack of it. The common variable essentially is good governance with the best practices that I mentioned earlier. I think that's what they're looking to implement. So for example, if you look, take one example, take Dubai for example, right? In its efforts to become a financial center and so on and so forth, the initial model it used was Singapore, right? It said, why is Singapore succeeding? Why can't we do the same? And today, by the way, in many areas, Dubai is ahead of Singapore, But clearly they went there and say, what can we learn from these parts of the world? And if you look at what King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is trying to do in setting up a university of science and technology, that's why does he want a university of science and technology? Because he believes that's what he'll use to transform his society and bring and modernize it. So the fact that they're thinking along those lines is a very positive development.
This university, I just got back from Saudi Arabia, actually just recruited away the president of Kishore's university to serve as the head of it, and it will be the first fully co-ed university in Saudi Arabia. It's interesting. There's a great book out that I want to recommend called Who Speaks for Islam, and it's essentially a major new book that surveys Muslims through the Islamic world, but a lot in the Arab world, and it was done by the Gallup organization. I have a copy of it, and we're going to invite the writers of the book here to address partly that question, but I think you'd be surprised by the answer. But let's, Mike Miyazawa.
Thank you. First of all, let me congratulate you for using the words the return of China, not the rise of China. I'm from Japan, and we know China is our immediate neighbor, and China has always been the superpower in the region. The last century was just an exception during their 4,000 years of history. Okay, my question is this. What do you think is the power or the source of power that could influence or reshape the rest of the world? And do you think Asia has that kind of power?
Well, I think one point I haven't emphasized is that we are in what I call a very plastic moment of world history. Everything is changing. And in terms of the ideas that we are going to turn to move forward, I want to emphasize this. Many of the ideas still come from the West. Whether it's free market economics, science and technology, education, rule of law. I mean, these are the pillars of Western wisdom I speak about. Many of the ideas are going to come from the West. But what's new, what the one contribution that Asia is going to make, by the way, is that it's going to demonstrate that in many areas it can perform as well as, if not better, than the West. And the most obvious example here again